Tennessee, we have a problem. So ideally, this video is going to be broken into 4 parts. First, I'll start with a section called Defining Terms, where I do just that. The second section will be called Bill Lee and Hypocrisy. Then we're going to talk about who is harmed and politicization and misinformation about the issue. Now, first, I want to jump into a little context of what exactly we're going to be talking about. So, drag, and I'll go into definitions in the defining terms part, but drag pretty much has been a hot topic for debate in Tennessee as of late, because Tennessee has actually become the first state to ban public drag performances. So that is sort of the setup for why I'm making this video and what I want to talk about, because I see a lot of misinformation, I see a lot of hate and just lack of understanding, and I want to clear that up. So yeah, you're along for the ride now. And I know I'm wearing the same thing as the last video, I swear it's a different day. I'll probably be wearing something else later on in the video. Anyway, yeah, drag. We're gonna get into it. We're gonna talk about why it seems all of a sudden drag is such a hot topic for debate rather than other issues. Alright, we're just gonna go ahead and jump into the first section, which is defining terms. And yes, this is a different outfit. Don't judge me. The definition I have here from the University of Connecticut's Rainbow Center's LGBTQIA+ dictionary defines drag as the performance of one or multiple genders theatrically. Pretty simple, right? I'm going to be using a couple definitions, and I might who knows what editing me will choose to do, but this one's from Urban Dictionary, and it says, a man who dresses as a flamboyant woman in order to entertain others, and that's of drag queen. Lastly, from Wikipedia, we have a definition of drag as a performance, and it says, the term drag refers to the performance of exaggerated masculinity, femininity, or other forms of gender expression, usually for entertainment purposes. So, yeah, that's a drag. We got our first term out of the way. Now, for the next term, we have sexual. I wonder what that would mean. But yeah, from the Merriam-Webster's dictionary, very simple, of relating to or associated with sex or the sexes, and second definition saying having or involving sex, obviously. So, those are our first 2 terms. The next thing we're going to get into is the bill itself, so that's going to be a bit more specific. So, the actual Tennessee bill I'm going to be talking about today is known as Senate Bill 3. And on the Tennessee General Assembly's website, the caption for this bill states, quote, an act to amend Tennessee Code annotated Title 7, Chapter 51, Part 14, relative to adult-oriented performances. Now that was a lot. We'll talk about it. You don't need to know all those numbers and everything. But another important caption mentioned that I'm just going to go ahead and read for you all. It says, obscenity and pornography, as enacted, creates an offense for a person who engages in an adult cabaret performance on public property or in a location where the adult cabaret performance could be viewed by a person who is not an adult. Yikes. We'll get into it. SB 3 was only filed for introduction back in November 9th of 2022 and officially was introduced to the Senate floor the 10th of January 2023. And this Senate bill also has one amendment, which the Senate adopted back in February 9th of this year. March 2nd of 2023 was the date that the Senate Speaker, the House Speaker, and the Governor all signed this bill, I guess, for their approval or whatever. Anyway, I'm going to talk about this amendment. Now, under Section 2, it says, 1. It is an offense for a person to engage in adult cabaret entertainment, which they did define earlier, A, on public property, or B, in a location where the adult cabaret entertainment could be viewed by a person who is not an adult. End quote. That goes further into the caption that I mentioned earlier and some of the language that was referencing. Now, technically still under Section 2, there's this part right here that reads, a first offense for violation of subdivision C1 is a Class A misdemeanor, and a second or subsequent such offense is a Class E felony. And then right under that begins Section 3, where it simply states one sentence. This act takes effect April 1st, 2023, the public welfare requiring it, and applies to prohibited conduct occurring on or after that date. We'll get into it. Now, while the official language of the bill did say it would take effect April 1st, 2023, today is April 1st, 2023, and turns out not yet. Note how I said yet. So, turns out there was this theater performance group named Friends of George's. And they actually filed a lawsuit to the district attorney regarding this bill, and just in time, Federal Judge Thomas Parker cited constitutional protections of freedom of speech in issuing a temporary restraining order. Now, that was a direct quote from NBC News article from literally today. So we'll see what happens in the future. The advocates for Friends of George's who filed the suit also see that this is only one step in an ongoing fight. So while it is good news, it's a little bit of good news. But anyway, now that you all know that, I think we can go ahead and move into Bill Lee and Hypocrisy, my favorite section. We love William Byron Lee. Right. So, new shirt, new part of the video. Let's go ahead and jump into Section 2, Bill Lee and Hypocrisy, my favorite. Now, for those of you who don't know, Bill Lee is the incumbent governor of Tennessee and has been since 2019. He was born and raised in Franklin, Tennessee, and as such, William Byron Lee has fulfilled one full term as governor, and recently won re-election over the Democratic candidate Jason Martin back in 2022. Now, according to Ballotpedia, Bill Lee's current term is going to last until 2027, and after that, he may have the option to run for re-election again. As I said a little bit before, Bill Lee signed SB 3 on March 2nd, 2023, the same date that the the Senate leader and the House leader signed it. An article from the Associated Press by reporter Kimberly Cruzy wrote in February about Bill Lee's support for restricting drag shows, as well as his response to people calling him a hypocrite, because a picture resurfaced of him wearing drag back when he was in high school. Now let me read you a quote from that article. Cruzy writes, Lee was presented with a photo that showed the governor as a high school senior dressed in women's clothing that was published in the Franklin High School 1977 yearbook. The photo was first posted on Reddit over the weekend. What a ridiculous question that is, said Lee, who was visibly angry. Conflating something like that to sexualized entertainment in front of children, which is a very serious question. That line is just so funny. He even uses the word conflating. It's like, you know what conflating is. One more thing I wanted to add about that Bill Lee quote. It's so interesting to me that he's calling it sexual when the bill specifically uses language that would have incriminated his own actions. And he seems to just be blind to that. And obviously, I don't think the man is stupid. I don't think most of these politicians passing hateful legislation are stupid. I think they know quite well what they're doing. But let me go ahead and read from this article from Northwestern University, published to their news journal. Now, this is in regard to Tennessee's drag ban specifically. And a few researchers, specifically Brian Mustansky, a clinical psychologist, is quoted as having said, "There is no evidence of children getting hurt at drag shows, but suicide and homicide are leading causes of death for teenagers, and we should put our energy into these very real and solvable problems." I definitely agree with that statement. Now, in the same Associated Press article, Cruzy writes, when asked specific examples of inappropriate drag shows taking place in front of children, Lee pointed to the school building close to where he was talking to reporters. Quote, "I think the concern is right there in that building," Lee said. "Children that are potentially exposed to sexualized entertainment, to obscenity, and we need to make sure that they're not. It's just so ironic to me because his own hypocrisy happened when he was in high school, when he was a high school senior. So he dressed in drag in part of a yearbook that was involving minors. So with his own logic, he would be culpable to the charges, which we'll talk about the charges of offenses in a little bit. Hypocrisy closes out her article by mentioning a really important fact about drag that I want to share with you all. She writes, quote, "Drag does not typically involve nudity or stripping, which are more common in burlesque, a separate form of entertainment. Explicitly sexual and profane language is common in performances meant for adult audiences. These routines can consist of stand-up comedy that may be raunchy or may pale in comparison with some mainstream comedians." End quote. Now, before we dive into who exactly is harmed by this and who all can be affected, let's go ahead and discuss the charges associated with the bill. From an article by Independent, they describe the charges, and I'll go ahead and read it to you in a quote. "An initial violation of the law would lead to a Class A misdemeanor with a maximum sentence of 11 months and 29 days in prison, in addition to a possible fine of as much as $2,500. Additional violations would be Class E felonies, leading up to 6 years in prison and a $3,000 fine." Aside from America's trend and continued practice of felonizing people as ways to disenfranchise and get rid of them from public eye, it's not too hard to see the more insidious implications of this bill. So first we're going to talk about who's harmed directly, and then we're going to talk about who's harmed indirectly. Now, most directly, obviously, will be drag performers themselves, who tend to perform in public. So what does that look like? That most people, when they think of a drag queen, they think of, an adult establishment, a drag queen expecting adults and maybe preparing a comedy sketch that goes with that, or wearing some impressionist outfit that appeals to those audiences. But most of the drag in public is not like that. Most of the drag in public simply, as defined before, is a theatrical performance of a different gender, and that goes alongside doing other things, like these drag queens who are paid to bring their service somewhere, to a public space, to do something. Maybe it's being a comedian, maybe it's singing or dancing or whatever. They are, like, that is their job, right? These drag performers specifically. So sure, they might be able to get a different job or only work in private establishments, but that's already a slippery slope, and we'll talk about why. Now, other than just drag performers themselves, theater groups or any sort of play or other stage performance that uses cross-dressing or some sort of similar motif might get, those performers might get called male or female impersonators and then be subject to this bill. That also goes with performers who have nothing to do with drag, who have nothing to do with theater, who just happen to dress outside their gender. So let's say I wear a dress and I go do a show. Like, I'm not necessarily in full drag. Like, there's not exaggerated features and heavy makeup, so I wouldn't be in drag. But under this bill, I still could be warranted to the charges. Now, indirectly, this affects a lot of people, and I would argue all Tennesseans, regardless of identity, regardless of anything. But firstly, it affects all Tennesseans because it is very unclear as to what male or female impersonator means, so that can be taken and run with it. It also, the bill mentions that entertainer does not even need to be someone who there is proven compensation provided for. So you could be like, oh, well, they can work that out where they prove you never got paid for anything, so you're off free, you wouldn't be charged. But the bill doesn't say that. It says that an entertainer can be someone who, like, regardless of compensation. So that is one way that it can affect many Tennesseans. Another way is trans people who may not necessarily pass very well. They may get actively hated on or just any queer individuals in Tennessee who maybe are visibly queer, that go against the sort of norm that someone could profile and be like, oh, you're a male and female impersonator. Oh, you're a pedophile, or you're a groomer, or some of these crazy words that people are throwing out in this sort of dialogue around drag. Now, again, as I said, I think that all Tennesseans are harmed, but let's talk about how kids themselves are harmed by diluting the seriousness of child sexual abuse, because we know that these things aren't happening at drag shows. But even with Bill Lee's statement earlier, he pointed to his school saying there's potential for obscene activity going on in there. What, he thinks drag queens are coming up to schools paid by public funds to strip for children? Is that what he thinks a drag queen is? Because when a drag queen expects a child audience, their only performance is wholesome. It's to read a book. It's to dance, to sing, to do a magic trick, for Christ's sake. It's not about being sexual innately, but because old crusty politicians like William Byron Lee, they sexualize that which they find different. And that's a personal problem, frankly. Alright, so now time for the last section, politicization and misinformation. Now, politicization, what does that mean? Well, it means when two groups become politically divided over something, right? Polarized. And it's really not a fully fledged conversation that I see people having a lot of the times. Now, some of my anecdotal experience of this comes from like online spaces where I talk to people. Like Facebook, for example. I'll put some videos where I explain some of the misconceptions about drag, and a lot of people don't want to watch it. They don't want to read it. They just respond with hate, and they react in this very fearful way that I feel a need to empathize with, because I can understand being scared of something, and I can understand not exactly even liking something, but that we should not be so flawed to allow that into the state house. Like this bill is on hold by that judge, but it will go into effect if all goes wrong and they can't clear it up in the courts. This bill will affect people's real lives. And personally, before going out, I felt confident in how I dressed, and I mean, I sort of still do, but I refuse to dress out of fear. Let me say that. I refuse to dress out of fear, even though it is, unsettling that this bill could apply to anyone. It could be applied to me legally. It can be applied to our teachers. It can be applied to our pastors. It can be applied to all sorts of people around us. It's just so insidious that this is an open doorway into legalizing bigotry and completely preserving LGBT hate in the state of Tennessee, especially with all the anti-trans bills going out in this state as well, and Bill Lee's personal position of being against any gender-affirming care for minors. Wow, that's depressing. A few more things I want to end on. Fear breeds hate, and misinformation greatly leads to fear. When people really don't know what they're talking about, they can be afraid of any sort of boogeyman someone mentions. And it is with clear and compassionate wisdom that we retaliate, because though I understand the anger, though I understand the outrage about all of this, people are people. Like, at the end of the day, we can't, I mean, I'm gonna be like, Billy's a piece of shit. But if I come up to someone and they're like, no, drag's not really good for kids, I need to approach that as a person first, rather than as a queer person first, because it's almost like this dissonance where I'm ready to defend it against anything. And we all need to bring in that sort of critical thinking and that critical analysis of especially new information if we want to combat things like hate and misinformation. That's the only effective way I believe we can do it. So that is what I want this channel to be. A place where I come here and I plan out a little video to talk about whatever things I want to educate people about, things I want to learn more about myself. You know, I can do that as I'm preparing the video. That's one thing. I didn't know half as much about bills in like a state house than I do now after having actually researched it. So I really just hope that I can use this channel to open some people's eyes and talk about problems. Anyway, I'm gonna go ahead and close this video out. But before I do that, stuffed animal of the day. This is Avery. We're gonna start doing stuffed animal of the day because I want to. And no one can tell me I can't. Anyway, I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.